May God enlighten the eyes of our hearts to know the hope to which Christ has called us. Amen. Please be seated. Well, as often happens, I kept sitting down this week with today's gospel with the intent of writing a sermon that's meaningful and profound and life-changing and casts a whole new light on an age-old text that all of us are probably far too familiar with anyway. And you'd think of all the parables, this one would be one of the easier ones to sermonize, because in a rare occasion, Jesus actually spells out the exact meaning of it. Usually he doesn't throw preachers like us a bone like that. We're left scrambling around in the obscurity of stories about birds and flowers and soil, trying to find out what on earth Jesus is talking about. But this week, I couldn't quite get past this first verse that we read a moment ago. It's almost flippant. Not part of the story, just the setting and the context for the story. That same day, it reads, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the lake. The great parable of the sower follows that little story, and who knows, maybe we'll get time to talk about it today. But for now, pause with me right here on this delicate and simple little moment. Now, perhaps that it's just that I just spent a couple of weeks in the Holy Land, and I too got the opportunity to sit on the lapping shore of the still, tranquil Sea of Galilee where we find Jesus in our reading today. But that little detail really struck me. Jesus goes out of the house, and he sits down on the shore. What's he doing? Not ministry, by the sounds of it. Praying, possibly. Though who knows how we really draw the line between actual prayer and the simple stillness of body and soul where we find ourselves in unforced awareness of God's presence. But whatever it is that Jesus is doing, he seems in no great rush to do it. Maybe instead of asking what Jesus is doing here, we'll have more luck asking why the gospel writer decided to include this benign little detail. Why expend ink mentioning something so banal? A different gospel writer, John, says that if we were to record all that Jesus did in his life and ministry, then the whole world would not have space for the books that would need to be written. So why did this beautifully benign little detail make it into the final cut? Well, I think this shines a light on a problem we have in the ways that we often read the Gospels. Reading the story of the Gospel is problematic for us because it sometimes suggests that Jesus' ministry just bounced from one significant moment to another. That Jesus' calendar was chock-a-block full of miracles and parables and run-ins with the authorities and deaths and resurrections and ascensions. We read the story that way because that's the natural way that we process stories. When you talk about your favorite movies to people, do you mention all the filler material between scenes or your favorite extra in the background? No. You talk about the moments of shock and awe and action and heartbreak that grip your attention and keep you there. When you tell people about your recent vacations, you don't regale them with a detailed account of the flight that you took to get there. Because all of us know that the movements between significant moments are not nearly as interesting to us as the moments themselves. None of us are much interested in the liminal middle ground in stories. And you'd be excused for thinking that that's how the gospel stories are written as well. A non-stop sequence of action-packed events. But actually, that's not entirely the story that the gospels are telling. We think it is, though, because when you get to a verse that says Jesus sat down by the lake, you read over it quickly to get to the next momentous event that the story is really about. Something that struck me from my time in the Holy Land was the very real limitations that come from reading a story as opposed to being in a story. The difference with being in a story as opposed to reading or telling a story is that in it you get a real sense of movement, don't you? Walking in the footsteps of Jesus in the Holy Land, I got just a tiny sense of how long it must have taken Jesus and his disciples to get from one place to another. I wondered what they talked about along the way. I wondered where they slept, what they ate, what kind of jokes and stories they told one another to pass the time. Thinking about the movement of Jesus and the simple, mundane middle ground between plot points in the gospel stories, I realized that what made these 12 young men disciples of Jesus was not that they were present at the great key moments. Those were almost always witnessed by great crowds of people. But rather what made them disciples, as opposed to just part of the crowd, was that they journeyed with Jesus in the leisurely, unextraordinary, in-between stuff of walking, sleeping, eating, and sitting down, passing the time. Indeed, it was in those moments that the great bulk of their growth and development and preparedness for their future ministry really happened, I think. And so what about us? Do we too seek God only in the grand stuff, the key plot points in our stories? Do we reach out for the guiding hand of God when it comes to career changes and vocation, moments of divine provision, grief and loss, emerging chapters of our lives for which we feel unequipped? Or do we look for the footsteps of Jesus guiding us in the life that happens in between, the slow movement between moments? Is that where we should really be attending to the grace and the growth in our lives? The British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan was once asked, "What's the hardest thing about being Prime Minister?" To which he famously replied, "Events, dear boy, events." So to misquote Macmillan, I think what often gets in the way of us attending to the quiet and faithful work of God in the everydayness of our lives is that we are attuned to God only in events, dear boy, events. But our stories, like the parables that Jesus so loved to confound us with, are not a series of unfortunate or fortunate events, but they're parables to inhabit and to live in. When we live into our stories, rather than trying to make perfect sense of our stories, trying to define the chapters and the plot points to make of our disparate lives something clear and linear, we find the grace of Jesus there. Maybe not doing something momentous, maybe not even on the move particularly, but maybe inviting us to sit and be present. Walking and growing with Jesus is not something that we can make sense of most of the time, or indeed even have that much control over. Rather, it takes place mostly through the everyday givenness of life as we receive it. Most of our growth and our maturation as people of God is subterranean. It happens without our noticing or our attention. Don't get me wrong, there's plenty we have to contribute in the process of growing into the grace that we've received. But mostly it happens beneath the surface. And that means that our discipleship, our posture of faith, will often require us to sit patiently and be still. We could all do with taking seriously the spirituality of sitting down beside a lake. Because Jesus doesn't seem to be in that great of a rush when it comes to our lives, does he? A great deal of spirituality happens in the stillness, the non-productive, the tranquil trust, the willingness to sit and let God do God's work in us. We try to wrench it from his hands and speed up the whole process, don't we? We try to grow at our own rate, too fast sometimes and often in the wrong direction. Our competing values and interests grow up unchecked because we haven't given God enough time to deal with the weeds in our own lives so that they don't choke out our faith. Or we don't let grace do the slow, subterranean work of setting deeper roots in us, roots of patience and trust, and so our faith withers at the first sign of trouble. Dear friends, may you give yourself permission to meet God in the life that is given to you today, and to trust that that is where grace is setting its roots and bearing its fruit in you. And if you want to know more about how that works, I encourage you to go read the parable of the sower. Thanks be to God.